Welcome back to the program, everybody. Welcome back to another show. Welcome back to another episode. Good morning to all of my viewers, listeners, and Soul Tribe family. By the time you most likely are hearing this, it's probably already the afternoon or the evening. So good afternoon and good evening as well to all of my viewers, listeners, and Soul Tribe family. The name of this program is called It's a Conspiracy, but It Ain't No Theory. This is episode number 42. On today's episode, I am going to be discussing gang stalking, plus surviving the New World Disorder per usual. Surviving manufactured chaos, surviving manufactured karma. My name is Adrienne Alese. I am the author and creator of a book trilogy called Lucy's Lair Part 1, 2, and 3. Lucy's Lair is a book trilogy reflecting my life as a survivor of rape culture, child sex trafficking, and psychological gas chambers. On this program, I advocate for women's rights, basic human rights, and the rights of those disabled. I also advocate on behalf of the foster children in the CPS system, orphans, single mothers, foster mothers, and those less fortunate. This program is a dedication to the targeted individual community, focusing today primarily on the technology-enabled coercive control, gang stalking, hyperstimulation. And so I believe for today's show, it is going to be episode number 42, and I'm going to be focusing primarily on technology-enabled coercive control. Testing 1, 2, 3, testing 1, 2, 3. I already know that they're going to be trying to make me have technical difficulties today, so I'm going to do my best to double check and make sure none of that happens, because they really, really, really don't want this information getting out there. It's quite ridiculous, the extreme lengths they've gone through. So the gang stalking and the hyperstimulation is no theory. I've proven that here on my program tons of times before. I pretty much prove that every time I do a show. That's kind of more or less what this show is emphasizing on and dedicated to exposing. So while they focus on the pettiest things, I'm here actually reporting true crimes, organized crimes, and organized hate groups. So they can continue to focus on all the pettiness, like farting and burping and, all the little petty things that they're doing, So the technical difficulties would be one of those for sure, one of those things or one of those tactics that the gang stalkers definitely use religiously, ritualistically. But I'm going to try to stay on point and on topic here today. So I actually named this article that I wrote. It is called Data Slaves. I am not done with this one, but I'm just scratching the surface here, really. So bear with me as I work to try to finish getting this information available to the public for free. So coercion. A person is guilty of coercion if by use of a threat he or she compels or induces a person to engage in conduct which the latter has a legal right to abstain from, or to abstain from conduct which he or she has legal right to engage in. Threat, as used in this section, means to communicate directly or indirectly the intent immediately to use force against any person who is present at the time. In Washington, coercion is a gross misdemeanor punishable by up to 364 days in jail and a fine of up to $5,000. Additionally, people convicted of domestic violence crimes in Washington face a $100 penalty. Coercion does not require any proof of physical harm. Forms of coercion include, but are not limited to, damaging, destroying, or threatening to damage or destroy goods, property, or items of special value, using technology to threaten, humiliate, or exert an undue influence over the other party, driving recklessly with the other party in the vehicle, threatening to harm the other party's career, exerting control over the other party's identity documents, making private information public or threatening to do so, causing dependence or confinement or isolating the other party from sources of support, engaging in psychological aggression, including inflicting fear, humiliating, degrading, or punishing the other party. Many victims of coercion file for domestic violence protection orders, while others may not ever make it to court or to the courthouse. Coercion involves compelling a party to act in an involuntary manner by the use of threats, including threats to use force against that party. Coercion involves a set of forceful actions which violate the free will of an individual in order to induce a desired response. Section 2422B of Title 18 provides that if the individual who has been persuaded, induced, enticed, or coerced to engage in prostitution or other criminal sexual act is under the age of 18, then the penalty is 15 years imprisonment and or a fine. So what is forcible compulsion in Washington state? Which, by the way, it's my opinion that that same rule should apply to all women of all ages and not just to children or minors. So, in any case, moving forward, the statute defines forcible compulsion as physical force that overcomes resistance. It could also include a threat that places a person in fear of death, physical injury, or fear that the person or third party will be kidnapped. So essentially the reason for today's, well, not just for today's episode, but for my show and for every episode, this is my reasoning here. So because I'm very much so in fear for my life and for the life of my children as well. So to continue, repeatedly putting you down, such as saying you're worthless, humiliating, degrading, or dehumanizing you. I've proved this in the past on the program, how that's done and why that's done. Controlling your finances, making threats, or intimidating you. The two main categories of coercion, deterrence and compellence, are distinct in their nature and requirements. If you want to sue, you will have to file in regular district court and may need the help of a lawyer. Coercion is described as intimate terrorism and is usually a pattern of behavior that includes trying to isolate, exploit, and control the victim. Essentially, the victim will feel like a hostage. Coercive control. The number one tactic usually used is isolation. Isolation is one of the most common tactics used by an abuser attempting to control their victim. Generally, this means that the abuser will not allow the victim to have contact with their friends and family, or at a minimum, restrict access to certain people. Additionally, by isolating the victim, the abuser can make it more difficult for the victim to leave the abuser. Control of victims. Abusers will also attempt to limit the amount of freedom that their victim has so that they feel dependent on the abuser. For example, the abuser will go with their partner everywhere, and if the partner tries to go somewhere alone, they are either further abused or made to feel guilty. In extreme cases, the abuser may deprive their partner of transportation or finances. So this is very much so the tactic that is being enforced upon myself. And so for the control of victims or the Abuse that is meant to deprive the victim of transportation sets the victim, myself, up for abuse by the intimate partner that the gang stalkers are attacking and terrorizing. In the toxic relationship, the aggressor for the criminal acts done by the terrorist organization to his family. So basically, what I'm trying to say is, by them impounding my vehicle, they make me stay in the relationship with the person that they're aggravating in order for that person to terrorize myself. And then, so that way, I won't be able to get any help. Misrepresentation. Another way in which abusers will abuse their victims is by misrepresenting them so that they feel isolated. For example, abusers will lie about their partners to others to make them look like the victim is the abuser, or they will attempt to make their partner look overly anxious, mentally ill, or disturbed. By doing this, the abuser hopes to gain more control over the partner, who may feel like they have no one else to turn to because everyone else thinks they are awful. All right, so you already know what's up. There are several distractions, and I just have to say, these people never stop, okay? They're relentless in their attempts to try to harass and frame, or set somebody up. So they get every bit of karma that they have coming their way. So, I don't feel bad at all. So, to continue, sorry about the awful interruption. So, like I was saying, misrepresentation. Another way. All right, so financial control. Another common tactic is financial control, which is generally seen when someone is abused. Controlling another person's finances can make a victim feel like it's impossible to get out of their situation. For example, a victim will usually have to run to a shelter because they have no money of their own, because their abuser took their paycheck and gave the victim a small allowance to ensure they couldn't run away. Sounds a lot like welfare. The more desperate someone feels, the more likely they will stay in a bad situation, which is ideal for the abuser. Monitoring activities. In some cases, the abuser goes to the extremes of monitoring the victim's every move. This can include installing cameras around the house and questioning the victim's whereabouts and conversations. When the abuser is not around, on the other hand, it could just be the abuser asking where the victim has been, what they were doing, and who they were with to gain control over where they're going and who they are going to be with. Using children as a weapon. If children are involved, one of the most successful control tactics an abuser will use is the children. There are two things that an abuser will usually do to gain control over the victim. 1, threaten to harm the children if the victim tries to fight back or leave. And 2, falsely accuse the victim of harming or neglecting the children. Well, that's a big one. This tactic is extremely successful because a victim will usually be very protective of their children. So any thought of losing their kids or them being abused is terrifying, of course. So it's really easy when you have children to be terrorized, because the first thing they'll attack is the weakest link. The revised Code of Washington states that extortion means knowingly to obtain or attempt to attain, knowingly to obtain or attempt to obtain by threat to property or services of the owner, and specifically includes sexual favors. So RCW 9856110, under this definition, any attempt, successful or not, to force someone else to give up money, property, or their services through the threat of violence or some other harm to that person or their reputation is extortion. The fact that the victim may actually consent to giving up the requested property or services, usually so as to avoid the threatened violence, does not change the fact that the crime of extortion has been committed or already been committed. The key element, the use of quote threat to get the property or services, is unaffected by the victim's consent. First-degree extortion, sexual bribery, sexual coercion, and sexual imposition are all types of sexual harassment and first-degree extortion. So the hotels here in Moses Lake are very much so corrupt as well. They are in bed with the corrupt politicians and the data slaves and technology-enabled coercive control. As technology plays an increasingly important role in our everyday lives, it has also become an incredibly powerful weapon for those who engage in stalking, harassment, and abuse. As previously mentioned in my book trilogy, Lucy's Lair, all forms of abuse begin and end with forced coercion. Coercive control reflects a pattern of behavior that is designed to assert influence and control over an individual's life using threats of harm, dependence, isolation, intimidation, and or physical forms of violence, often resulting in a survivor losing all sense of their self-worth, independence, and safety. Today I'm going to be reviewing technology-enabled coercive control and how technology-enabled coercive control extends this pattern of abuse to include all the ways technology facilitates coercive control. Forms of technology-enabled coercive control include cyberstalking, monitoring, impersonating, harassment, distribution of intimate images, along with other related patterns of violence that use technology as a weapon to abuse, exploit, harass, and stalk. The context of intimate partner violence, those who engage in technology-enabled coercive control rely on overlapping tactics that involve forms of technology to exploit targets 24/7, instilling feelings of fear, isolation, confusion, and terror amongst those they are targeting. 97% of the program providing advocacy and support services report that abusers misuse technology to stalk, harass, and control their target. Those who use technology as a weapon to engage in coercive control benefit from its mobility, accessibility, and usability. Most tech-based harassment occurs on social media platforms and phone-based apps, which are free or low-cost. More complex spyware and malware software are available for purchase online and obtained instantly. Hacking is also free. The overall cultural acceptance of tracking and monitoring as ordinary or normal behavior also enables those who abuse technology and human trafficking. This normalization ranges from the surveillance cameras in public spaces to the development of products marketed to parents to track and monitor children to the practice of, quote, Facebook stalking. The normalization of technology to stalk and surveil in everyday life also serves to minimize its effects on survivors. Additionally, research indicates that most stalkers rely heavily on unsophisticated forms of technology to engage in coercive control, furthering the problematic notion that this misconduct is trivial and inconsequential. Additionally, research indicates that most stalkers rely heavily on unsophisticated forms of technology to engage in coercive control, furthering the problematic notion that this misconduct is trivial and inconsequential. Research indicates that those working within the civil and criminal legal systems trivialize technology-enabled coercive control and even threaten survivors with contempt. All the research and first-hand accounts affirm that experiencing technology-enabled coercive control result in significant negative impacts on survivors. The ability to engage in the technology-enabled coercive control is easily available to abusers across socioeconomic status. It involves hacking and requires little to no formal training or education to be effective. Many of the systems meant to support survivors trivialize technology-enabled coercive control and lack sufficient training and resources to effectively respond. Those who engage in technology-enabled coercive control are rarely held accountable for their behavior, and the survivors experience little in the way of relief as technology-enabled coercive control. Cyber terrorists wreak havoc on all aspects of their lives. Technology-enabled coercive control is not only prevalent and pervasive, it is now standard and often the primary form of abuse that intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking survivors experience. Those who engage in technology-enabled coercive control display a persistent capability to evolve and advance in their ability to use and abuse technology to harass and terrorize. The systems meant to support survivors and hold offenders accountable continue to lag behind. Those working to end gender-based violence should be warned that technology represents a serious emerging form of abuse. Today, those who abuse technology maintain the advantage as technology-enabled coercive control continues to outpace current laws, despite a recent flurry of newly enacted cybercrime legislation across the country, particularly in response to non-consequential pornography and the disclosure of intimate images. As an advocate and survivor of TECC, technology-enabled coercive control, I am directly connected to this problem, the professional studies, and the community research. The methodical framework guiding this project is rooted in the principles of community-based participatory action research. As a research methodology, community-based participatory action research emphasizes the needs and knowledge of the community being studied and engages community participants as active members of the project. CBA is also kind of short for CBPAR, so you may also see CBP for short on a stalker's license plate as well. Community-based participatory action research attends to inequities and injustices, encourages community members' power over their own lives, works to prevent exclusion and promote diversity of participation, builds and expands on local partnerships that support the action necessary to achieve change. Community-based participatory action research also begins by assuming that those who have been most systemically excluded or oppressed carry a specific wisdom about their lives and the structure and fracture points that led to their experiences. Although I will note that when this is manufactured, it is way less effective. In response, community-based participatory action research centers collaborative knowledge production in which knowledge analysis and agents in action collectively emerge between researchers and participants across all stages of a project with the goal of promoting change. From detectives to prosecutors to advocates to survivors themselves, consensus among those who contributed to this research project is that technology-enabled coercive control has significant adverse impacts on survivors. Individual survivors report physical, emotional, psychological, and financial insecurities that result from experiencing technology-enabled coercive control. That technology-enabled coercive control negatively impacts every aspect of their lives and has long-lasting effects. Research participants describe technology-enabled coercive control as a form of psychological torture and that it results in constant feelings of hypervigilance, fear, and uncertainty. Research participants report that technology-enabled coercive control elicits a sense among survivors that the abuser's presence is constant, unremitting, omnipresent, and inescapable. Excuse me. Research participants also describe technology-enabled coercive control as debilitating and that it causes feelings of hopelessness. Or you can also relate this to a manufactured depression diagnosis.
Society. In April of 2021, we exposed a massive child trafficking operation being operated by the federal government in concert with Catholic charity organizations. In March of 2022, the Biden administration formally exempted unaccompanied children from being deported under the Title 42 policy. Last month, a whistleblower from Operation Artemis testified before Congress that the U.S. government has been acting as middleman in a multi-billion-dollar child trafficking black market. Title 42 is set to expire this week, and U.S. immigration facilities are already at 150% capacity. So the tens of thousands of illegal immigrants waiting at the southern border will just have to be taken care of at the expense of the U.S. taxpayer during the biggest financial crisis in U.S. history.
They don't go through any of that stuff. And none of the Chinese women coming through ever report being raped. All sorts of women are raped, young and old, and children and everything else. But not the Chinese.
If this doesn't make sense to you, then you...
This is usually done during the isolation process. For survivors of technology-enabled coercive control who seek relief and accountability through the civil and criminal legal systems, research participants indicate that this process is re-traumatizing and often ineffectual. The community, more often than not, is encouraged not to help and even severely punished for empathizing with victims or survivors. Research participants cited positive uses of technology, especially in the context of enhancing a survivor's safety plan. However, it is my opinion that it is impossible to prevent these tragedies from happening, which is why so many people take the job opportunity of continuing this cycle or fear cycle and keeping this etheric implant or this traumatic cycle open as long and as much as possible so that the system can continue to capitalize off of our suffering. Providers also noted that they lack a structure for learning and sharing knowledge. So this is really relevant because it goes to show how the quote, knowledge is power, and how they kind of use this knowledge to their advantage and keep it to themselves and amongst themselves in a very occult-like fashion. But to continue, providers also noted they lack a structure for learning and sharing knowledge about this helpful technology because units and offices lack institutionalized opportunities for training. As perpetrators develop expertise in the area of technology-enabled coercive control, they are promoted and their willingness to cooperate leaves with them. And so, like I've already recently stated, this implies a deep-seated underlying corruption scandal. So, but anyways, to continue, transition and high turnover in certain units lends to an informal and consultation structure that relies on interpersonal relationships for information sharing. Without a plan to institutionally hold and support this knowledge, providers are unable to provide meaningful help to survivors. Research participants indicate that Seattle's response to address technology-enabled coercive control is inconsistent and inadequate. Overwhelmingly, providers demonstrate commitment to supporting survivors and holding those who engage in technology-enabled coercive control accountable, but identified a need for support and resources in order to do so effectively. Both providers and survivors agree that current practices fall short of effectively responding to survivors' concerns. Additionally, Seattle has not fully integrated technology-enabled coercive control into its existing domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking protocols and assessment strategies. While technology is integrated into our communities, relationships, and workflow, providers often discuss and respond to cyberstalking as a distinct form of stalking. Survivors experiencing technology-enabled coercive control who report to law enforcement describe filing numerous police reports across jurisdiction that law enforcement failed to connect as a pattern of crime or racketeering or dismiss as non-criminal behavior altogether. This emotional manipulation is another form of psychological coercion. The allocation of resources to investigate and prosecute technology-enabled coercive control, particularly at the misdemeanor level, are insufficient. The civil protection order process is outdated, and survivors of technology-enabled coercive control are unable to reliably submit digital evidence into the record, into the database. The lack of a comprehensive response both fails and re-traumatized survivors of technology-enabled coercive control. The community currently lacks sufficient technology-enabled coercive control specific awareness, raising the educational programming level to prevent individuals from experiencing technology-enabled coercive control and engaging in technology-enabled coercive control, including a lack of focus on concepts such as privacy, digital consent, and bystander intervention when digital consent is not respected. Research participants also indicated a dearth of existing community-based resources to support survivors of technology-enabled coercive control, particularly low-income survivors. Survivors of technology-enabled coercive control lack sufficient awareness to material resources such as low-cost or smartphones to replace compromised devices, as well as consultative of resources such as access to local trained technology specialists to provide one-on-one consultation and individualized technology safety planning. Research participants also identified a lack of community-based resources for survivors of acquaintance and stranger stalking occurring outside of an intimate relationship. This is also called third-party stalking or abuse by proxy. Providers also identified interest in establishing a centralized unit responsible for housing and maintaining shared resources related to technology-enabled coercive control, including templates and investigative materials that would be stored on a shared resource drive. It has been recommended drawing on existing enterprise in this area and expanding the Special Operations Unit to serve as a designated technical and consultation resource within King County. Additionally recommended formalized communication and collaboration between the public and private sectors, including establishing contacts with tech companies for increased cooperation around investigations and to develop a potential pool of expert witnesses for civil and criminal proceedings. Experiencing technology-enabled coercive control has resulted in survivors losing their jobs, a sense of safety, and their public reputations. We can not only frame the system or response around physical violence and or death. Research participants recommend dictating increased investigative support to technology-enabled coercive control-based crimes, especially misdemeanor crimes. Finally, the Department of Corrections should create technology-enabled coercive control specific supervision plans for those under post-incarceration DOC supervision for a technology-enabled coercive control-related crime. Taken together, the implementation of the above recommendations will create meaningful intervention at every step of the legal process and triage system that prioritizes cases based on the lethality and survivor impact. I recommend that high-tech safety planning training Content be made available to advocates along with regular booster training that reflects the ever-changing landscape of technology-enabled coercive control. Digital consent prevention programming encourages safe and healthy interactions when texting, using social media, and sharing information and images/videos online. I also recommend a multifaceted prevention campaign that encourages parents to discuss digital consent with their children. Research participants also identify the responsibility of private sector tech companies to participate and lead public awareness, raising technology-enabled coercive control prevention campaigns. I recommend that the information be made available to survivors and community members broadly about how to safely maintain their accounts and data. I also recommend dictating resources to support survivors' material needs, including a compromised device replacement program and in-home surveillance systems for survivors who identify these and other resources as part of their safety plan. I also recommend providing funding to support institutionalize and expand technology-enabled coercive control clinics. Throughout Seattle, technology-enabled coercive control clinics provide survivors with free one-on-one consultation with a trained technologist to assist survivors in identifying points of compromise on devices and to develop safety and mitigation plans in response. Research participants also reflected on the convenience of technology and how this convenience has implications for coercive control dynamics. Technology made engaging in coercive control easy when a pattern of stalking might once have required physically pursuing someone. The work of stalking has been automated and in many aspects requires less time and effort by the abuser. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off for the day. That was adequate enough for one show, and I think that, and I hope that my viewers, listeners, and Soul Tribe family will be satisfied with that, or at least content with that. I will do my best in the future to try to go ahead and cover this topic a little bit more. But for now, I think that's going to do it for today's show. Thank you for joining me, you guys. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a beautiful day. I will get back at you as soon as I can.